Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're talking about a rather obscure rifle that probably most have never heard of because it never really left a proof of concept stage. This is the M16A5. Now, the M16A5 concept was a Marine concept. It was not an Army concept. At the time the Marines came out with this requirement was probably around the 2013, in that time period, not exactly sure when. But it was at the time where the Army had already switched over to the M4 carbine. They were basically stopped production and stopped accepting any M16A2s or A4 rifles. They pretty much figured that the M4 was going to be the next U.S. service rifle. And again, the M16A2s and the A4s were going to the Afghan Army and the Iraqi Army. However, the Marine Corps, on the other hand, who, as many of you know, is very, very hell-bent in tradition. In fact, a lot of that tradition overshadows progress, which it can be sort of a sad thing, but it's what they do. They did not want to leave the concept of the full-length rifle behind. They liked the fact that they had the 20-inch barrels, and it was getting the maximum amount of accuracy and the maximum amount of velocity, thermal performance out of it, and of course reliability, because the rifle is best tuned with a rifle length gas system. So basically, they took a look at what the Canadians were doing with their service rifle, and it was fairly new at the time. It was probably around 2000, around the 2002 time period, where the Canadians came up with their midlife upgrade to their C7A1 series rifle. So let's talk about the Canadians right now, because that's really where the M16A5, or what the M16A5 is, basically. The Canadians utilized the C7A1 carbines for several years. That was their second generation version, utilizing a flat top upper receiver. They were the first military to use an M16 series rifle with a flat top upper receiver, and to have every soldier have an LCAN optic on it. The big change was the adoption of body armor. If you look at the Cold War era, where the C7s and the C7A1s were used, that was prior to the use of the real heavy body armor, which would be coming out of the global war on terror. The Canadians had adopted that body armor, and they had found that the C7A1s, same thing we find with the M16A4s here in the United States military, because we're using the same kind of body armor, that because of that long stock and because of that hefty bulk on the body armor, the rifle is being pushed forward. Now, when the rifle is being pushed forward, first off, your line of sight with your iron sights is off. You're basically, your head's too far away from it. Your eye relief on your optic is also very, very terrible. Your ability to maneuver back and forth, because the rifle is being pushed forward, it was just not a comfortable and not a good way to shoot. Again, your eyes just don't line up with your optics and your sights. So what the Canadians did was they went with a standard carbine receiver extension, and they went with a standard C8 stock, and they went with a new buffer. Again, due to the dynamics of the 20-inch barrel, it's going to require a certain kind of a buffer, a certain weight on that buffer, to prevent the bolt carrier bounce. Those of you who are familiar with the early days of the Vietnam War, when your cyclic rate increased with the use of ball powder, the bolt carrier you were increasing a rate of fire by over 200, 300 rounds a minute. When the rifle was firing at 650 rounds a minute, the original Edgewater buffer worked great. It didn't have carrier bounce, but when you start speeding that up and that carrier was hitting that receiver extension, it was bouncing back, and that was causing carrier bounce. So they had to increase that weight to stop that. And how they did that was 5 sliding steel weights. The 5 sliding steel weights slowed down the carrier somewhat in its velocity, but those the weights, which moved forward when the bolt carrier would go forward and it would hit the barrel extension, the weights would move rearward and move forward, and it would absorb that shock, and it would stop that carrier bounce. So they had to do the same thing with the C7A2, with that, utilizing the telescopic stock assembly. So they had to go with a buffer that gave you the same weight of basically the 5 steel weights, and they had to have some additional cuts in there to get that to have enough weight in there to prevent that carrier bounce. I have to tell you that I am not exactly sure how that buffer works. In my research, I haven't been able to find out exactly what the Canadian buffers were. I'm imagining they're doing the same things that we had to do here in the U.S. with the M16A5, that they probably had to duplicate the weight of the 5 steels weights, and then they had to cut those in half, so you had additional weights going back and forth to stop the carrier bounce. They did a few other things as well. First off, the stock assembly, they changed it to a green color, and they kept the original, it was more of a Colt Type 2 smooth stock. They basically said they wanted to keep that because of decontamination issues. It was easier for them to do a chemical decontamination with that than it was with the stock that the Americans used. They wanted to go with green. So then you move to the pistol, then you move to the lower receiver. Modification was the pistol grip was green, and they decided to go ambi. So they have an ambidextrous selector. However, the Canadians never actually wrote safe semi-auto on the right side of the rifle. Only they just had just on the left-hand side. They also went with a ambi magazine release. They went with the Norgon ambi cache. They got rights from Norgon to be able to produce that for the lower receiver. So that is your C7A2 lower receiver. Now your upper receiver, on the other hand, basically you took your original C7A1 upper, you removed the charging handle, you moved the latch, replaced the latch with a new ambidextrous charging handle latch. Again, same charging handle. Threw your bolt carrier group back in there. You removed your black A2 handguards, replaced them with green ones, and then they added a triad, which is basically a 1913 rail adapter that clamps to the front sight base. So you had short rails on the right and left hand side, and a very small one on the bottom. And there was your C7A2, your midlife upgrade. Now, the Canadians, again, they believed very much in the accuracy, the reliability, and the ability to use that in a more mounted environment where you had the telescopic stock to use for the body armor. Now, you have to admit that it didn't really help all that much. It did help with the shooting, but for as far as the mounted environments, not so much because that 20-inch barrel was still long getting in and out of vehicles. But that rifle would remain as a Canadian rifle, service rifle, right up until more recently when they adopted a new version, which is based off of the IUR, which is a one-piece upper receiver. So again, the Marine Corps looks at that and says, "Hoorah! That's what we want. We want to take our M16A4s and we wanted to put the telescopic stocks on them, keeping with our tradition for the longer range shooting. We want the longer range capabilities. The Army's going for the M4. We're not going to do what Army does. We're going to go our own way." So the requirement came out, again, I believe it was around 2013 in that time period. Again, that was the time period where the Army had already basically said, we're done with the A2s and the A4s, and we're going full fleet with the M4s. So the main difference between the M16A4 and the A5 was the stock assembly. They went with the same solution that the Canadians did with going with a telescopic stock assembly. There's two different ways that those stocks were done. The first one was utilizing as many parts as possible that were already in inventory. Well, it worked out very well because if you look at the stock assembly that was used on the M16A5, every part was in the inventory. The only part they had to change was the buffer. And again, because of the velocity of that bolt carrier, because of that system, you had to have, again, the weight in a carbine weight. You had to have the same weight of the 5 steel. But you also had to have enough mass moving back and forth that's going to absorb that shock from that bolt carrier smashing into the barrel extension. So what the solution was referred to as an H6 buffer. What an H6 buffer is a standard carbine buffer with 3 weights, but each of those weights was cut in half. So now you have 6 smaller weights that move back and forth. So what that did was, when that bolt carrier would close on this closing stroke, and it would slam into that barrel extension from that higher velocity caused by that longer gas system, the weights would go to the rear, and then when they go forward, the weights would bounce off, and it would cause that dampening, and it would stop that carrier bounce. So basically, you have a rifle that's all standard components, just with a new buffer. The next one was the one that probably worked the best. It was a little more expensive, but it was definitely the best solution that was out there, and that was made by Voltor. The Marines work with Voltor on what's referred to as the Voltor A5 buffer system. So what that was a complete redesign. It was sort of a mid-length, if you want to call it, in between the rifle and the carbine length. So basically, you have a buffer. Now, the buffer was made longer, so instead of carrying just three weights, the A5 buffer carried 4. Well, what that did, again, decreased you to 4 weights. By mixing and matching the buffer weights, the steel versus the tungsten, you're able to get up to H6, or in some cases even more than that. You could go from a standard weights of an H to an H2, H3, H4, H5. And I believe they even had one that was larger than that. So again, you had a longer buffer. You also had, I believe it was a 5/8 of an inch longer receiver extension, again, to utilize that longer buffer. And you also used a standard rifle recoil spring. You didn't have a proprietary spring. Your positions, you had 7 positions instead of 4 or 6. You had an additional position on there as well. Now, what this did was this worked excellent for as far as balancing that system out by having that additional length and by having that additional weight and all that way that worked. There was less wear on the components. It increased reliability, increased service life, and it was even more comfortable. I believe, at least the ones I've used, I felt it was more comfortable than that stock. And when you actually opened it up, it went up to like 16 and a quarter inches. It was, the stock was actually longer than the standard mil spec stock. Now, the stock that went on there, you could use a mil spec stock on there, but they used what was called the E-mod stock, which was a longer clubfoot type stock. It had additional storage compartments for batteries. Those of us who had beards, though, didn't like it because your beard got caught on it. But that system was specifically designed for the A5. That's where the A5 comes from. So those are provided to the Marine Corps as well for the conversions of these rifles. Both of these, because the A5 was never type classified, they were modifications to the rifle. So there was actually an article put out in one of their maintenance manuals that states that they had to be put on by a certified armorer, but when the rifles were turned back in, they had to have the original stocks put back on them. So the rifles were converted basically in their own armories at unit level, with that. Now, this lasted a very, very brief period of time. The Marines were finally forced to basically abandon that and go with the M4, which they eventually did. Now, these were used. They were used in Afghanistan. They were used in Iraq. The A5, the A5 configuration with the telescopic stock with a 20-inch barrel. I was in Afghanistan in 2011, my first time. I think it was 2011 or 2012. I was at Bagram, Special Forces Camp Vance, at the armory that was in there, and I was assisting them with doing some repair work. And I actually was doing some repair work on an M16A2 that had the standard mil spec receiver extension on it with the H6 buffer. So, I actually had an A2. I had seen A4s that were there as well. I'm not saying I saw a lot of them, but I did see them. There is pictures of them being utilized in combat. They were used. It certainly was a good, viable design. However, again, it didn't seem worthwhile for the benefits of the 20-inch barrel would give you over a 14 and a half to have to modify these rifles. So now let's talk a little bit more about what the Marine Corps was doing with the Voltor for as far as the A5 rifle system. When the Marine Corps went to work with Voltor on making the finalized A5 type rifle, they wanted to have a new upper receiver. They wanted to have a free float upper receiver, again, to increase the accuracy, harmonics, all that good stuff. So Voltor came out with what they referred to as the VIS rail, which again, it looked like it was one piece, but it was actually 2. Voltor didn't want to pay Carl Lewis for a royalty on a one-piece upper, so it was 2 pieces that were braced together. The upper receiver had forward assist on it. It was a little bit different of an architecture to it. It looked a little bit different than that of the standard M16A4 type rifle upper receivers. It had a lower handguard would remove. You could place a grenade launcher on it. It was a relatively expensive design. At that time, it was key mod. At the time this came out, M-LOK was not yet a thing. The key mod was probably the first step after the 1913 rail that they were to go with that. Again, the lower receiver that was built up for the A5 for Voltor as well, it had the A5 stock, the E-mod stock. It had the lower receiver had 2 QD points at the rear behind. The forward assist was actually moved forward on the upper receiver so it wouldn't interfere with the use of the charging handle or with being able to hook a QD attachment onto it. However, it was very, very basic. Again, 20-inch barrel. Now, that rifle, I don't believe I ever saw in service anywhere. It was a proof of concept that was done. Again, the Marine Corps did buy the receiver extensions. They did buy the E-mod stocks. They just didn't really do anything with the upper receivers. They stuck with the mil spec components of the M16A4. So most of the time when you would see them a quote A5 configuration, it's all A4 from the rear of the receiver forward, but it's from the rear of the receiver to the stock is where it became the A5. There was never a type classification for it. It was midterm. It was a thought. It was a concept. The stocks were authorized to go on the guns, as I said previous. You did see them in service. I saw them in service in several places throughout the world. It definitely it definitely was a good idea. It was a good idea to the fact that, again, we're using body armor, we're using 20-inch barrels, especially if you look at the earlier days of the global war on terror. One of the biggest problems the M4 had was there wasn't enough of them to go around. Everybody wanted M4s, but Colt could only produce so many of them. And of course, at that time, Colt was the sole source. So whatever Colt could make is what the government got. There wasn't a, quote, emergency where the government could go and have a second source make them because of it being time of war. So the telescopic stocks on the A2s and A4s did offer a viable option to the troops that couldn't get M4s. I wish I had more of an idea of what those numbers were of how many of those guns actually existed, or how many of those stocks that were bought. But you still do see them into service even to this day. However, you are pretty much seeing full fleets with M4s in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Marines are using the M16A5s, whatever configuration they are. So the 20-inch barrels are pretty much gone. I can remember at my time at Colt, we had stopped making them around, I would say 2007, 2008. We had stopped making any full-length rifles or A4s for the U.S. government. The only ones that we manufactured while I were there, we manufactured a whole run for the Afghan government, which was sort of sad seeing all those guns in the hands of Taliban after they were left. But we only made them for foreign governments. We never made them for the U.S. government, probably after the 2008 time period. So I hope you guys enjoy this video on this more obscure rifle that no one's really ever heard of. To give you a little bit of a background where it came from, why it didn't last, but it was a good idea at the time in that transition from the A4 to the M4, or the A2 to the M4 to the A4. Hope you enjoyed this video. Do please click like, please subscribe, but even better, share. Thank you.